We are here with yet another book review. You guys need to start reading. I'm telling you, it's going to change your life. It's going to change your way of thinking. This is Ayn Rand. This is a very small, but not easy to read book. But it essentially discusses her philosophy of objectivism. And if you don't want to read her long books of fiction, Atlas Shrugged, Fountainhead. I read those two. I believe the other one was Anthem. I haven't read that. That's on my list to read. But supposedly Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead are the best ones. I personally found Fountainhead more enjoyable than Atlas Shrugged, although Atlas Shrugged is more famous. Do not watch the movie. It's awful. They need to redo both of those movies, or at least redo Atlas Shrugged and make a Fountainhead movie because that one was horrible. But if you don't want to read those monstrosities of books, you can just read this. It's basically her thesis in a bite-sized, almost pocket-sized. I found myself actually carrying this book around with me when I would go places. I do have a Kindle, but sometimes I prefer physical books. And the Kindle is good because you can like take things and make them portable, but nothing beats an actual book other than needing like actual light to read it with a Kindle. You don't need light, you have the backlight. But anyways, her philosophy is more important now than ever. I do predict that will see a rise in socialism and Doge, Department of Government Efficiency cuts are going to lead to a lot of people. Ultimately, I feel it's good for the country, but in the short term, there's going to be a lot of pain, and the danger of that is a return towards socialism, or at least socialism becoming popular again, which kind of has been. Collectivism, at least, has been popular. And this book was written in 1964. It's a collection of essays, mostly by Rand, but some by a guy named Nathaniel Branden, who was her collaborator at the time. Objectivism is her philosophy. I'm not sure if I agree entirely with objectivism, uh, but I agree with the majority of her writing, so maybe I do agree with objectivism. But her objectivism is essentially Rand's philosophy that reality exists independently of our thoughts. So basically, objective reality. Which I think I'm too spiritual of a person to actually buy into it because I do believe that thoughts manifest reality, and I am, I guess, one of these spiritual hippies or whatever you want to call it. But I do believe our thoughts are powerful enough. I actually think the universe as we know it is built on consciousness. So I don't know if that is congruent with objectivism, but regardless, when we come back down to earth, I agree with her philosophy on objectivism. Maybe I just disagree with it on a spiritual level, but on a objective reality level, it's hard not to agree with it. So basically, the root of her philosophy, and this is where I do agree with 100%, humans should use reason to pursue their own happiness as the highest moral purpose. And Ayn Rand argues that selfishness is morally good, not bad, hence the title, The Virtue of Selfishness. So, what if selfishness isn't the villain that we've all been taught? Ayn Rand says it's the hero of a good life. And selfishness, to Ayn Rand, in Rand's own terms, is acting in your own rational self-interest, not exploiting others, but prioritizing your own life and happiness. And there's a key quote in here regarding this topic, and it's the objectivist ethics holds that the actor must always be the beneficiary of his action, and that man must act for his own rational self-interest. This means you're the point of your own life, not a means to someone else's end. Now, I think where Rand would disagree with me and where maybe I'm not as purist as her, I do believe a social safety net does need to exist for vulnerable populations, the mentally ill, the people that are not able to necessarily deuce to the extent that society rewards, and also the elderly and the nuclear family in this country is kind of not respected like it is in most other countries. I'm Romanian, my wife's Mexican. In both of our respective countries, you don't put parents in nursing homes. And in the United States, it seems to be that's the default is you go to nursing homes when you get older. And so if you're going to live in a society where that's the default, you kind of need to have a social safety net because not everyone can afford to send their family to nursing homes and things like that. But she also says altruism is bad. And to me, when I read this is shocking because I find that altruism, I've always been taught altruism's not bad. And the belief that morality requires self-sacrifice and putting others' needs above you, Rand rejects this as harmful. I think individual virtues should include altruism. However, to manage a society, especially in a capitalistic society like ours, you kind of have to have some kind of altruism embedded. Unfortunately, we don't have it embedded at the individual level. We've always been taught, especially here in the Western world in the United States, you got to get ahead, put yourself first. And as a casual observer, right, like I said, I'm actually born in Romania. We moved here when I was 2 years old. My wife's from Mexico. People are more inherently altruistic in those countries. I think because in the United States, everything is more like you're kind of like in a rat race. I live 30 minutes from the Mexican border. When I go to Mexico, now let's ignore the fact that Mexico is not this utopia. I'm not trying to make it out to be a utopia. I'd much rather be in the United States, but there's elements from Mexico that I think are superior. And one of them is this kind of laid back approach to things. Like over here in the US, it's all hustle, hustle, hustle. And some people interpret that as me, selfish, selfish, selfish. Whereas when you go to Mexico, it is really more about the community and maybe it is more collectivist. But I see that on the individual level and not on the societal level. On the societal level in Mexico, it definitely is more collectivist than the United States. But I see that as a good thing, is what I'm trying to say, on the individual level, not on the societal level. So you kind of have to pick your poison. I'd much rather our government leave us alone and not mandate collectivism. But then that means we got to reteach our future generations. As someone who just had a newborn, I think it's up to the parents to instill altruism in their kids. I don't believe government's role is to enforce altruism in order to have some collectivist outcome. And hopefully, I'm not boring you with my philosophy. She's got an entire chapter on racism. Now, let me just read some of directly from this chapter because it definitely applies to today, and this was written in 1960, pre-civil rights and all that. Racism is the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. It is the notion of ascribing moral, social, or political significance to a man's genetic lineage. The notion that a man's intellectual and characterological traits are produced and transmitted by his internal body chemistry, which means in practice that a man is to be judged not by his own character and actions, but by the characters and actions of a collective of ancestors. Racism's claims that the content of a man's mind, not his cognitive apparatus, but its actual content, is inherited, that a man's convictions, values, and characters are determined before he is born by physical factors beyond his control. This is the caveman's version of the doctrine of innate ideas, or of inherited knowledge, which has been thoroughly refuted by philosophy and science. Racism is a doctrine of, by, and for brutes. It is a barnyard or stock farm version of collectivism, appropriate to a mentality that differentiates between various breeds of animals, but not between animals and men. She goes on here, just as there is no such thing as a collective or racial mind, there is no such thing as a collective or racial achievement. There are only individual minds and individual achievements, and culture is not the anonymous product of undifferentiated masses, but the sum of the intellectual achievements of individual men. She then goes on to say modern racists attempt to prove the superiority or inferiority of a given race by the historical achievements of some of its members. The frequent historical spectacle of a great innovator, she goes into like a bunch of different stories. All these are samples of racism, manifestations of a doctrine whose full expression is the tribal warfare of prehistorical savages, the theory that holds good blood or bad blood as moral intellectual criterion. Then she says, like every other form of collectivism, racism is a quest for the unearned. It is a quest for automatic knowledge, for an automatic evaluation of men's characters that bypasses the responsibility of exercising rational or moral judgment, and above all, a quest for an automatic self-esteem or pseudo self-esteem. Historically, racism has always risen or fallen with the rise or fall of collectivism. 2025, maybe? There is only one antidote to racism, the philosophy of individualism, and its politico-economic corollary, laissez-faire capitalism. So that's where I agree with her. I do believe that we are living in a pretty damn selfish society. So to advocate for more selfishness is kind of something that's not needed. However, I think the way we need to think about this is we just came out of an administration where the Biden administration, where everything was centered around collectivism. How do we improve things for underserved groups? And the antidote, according to Ayn Rand, is not government involvement. It's laissez-faire capitalism. It's judging people on their individual merits and helping individuals raise their own standards. But it's much more complicated than Rand would care to admit, even in this book. So the way I read this book, I view it as a form of government playbook, basically, for creating a society that is most efficient and ultimately most virtuous. But in order to do that, it boils down to the individuals needing to think about how selfish they are. Reason, according to Ayn Rand, is defined as logical thinking based on facts, not feelings or faith. Rand says it's our tool for survival and morality. Man's mind is his basic tool of survival. To live, man must hold three things as the supreme ruling value of his life: reason, purpose, self-esteem. Individualism, she's a big advocate for, defined as prioritizing the individual over the group. Happiness coming from your own achievements. The common good of a collective, let's say a race, a class, a state, was the claim and justification of every tyranny ever established over men. So it always comes back to government and how, like, so I do think Rand's, this is a direct response to government control and government agendas and makes you think how racism and different things that cause emotions. Alistair McIntyre, in another book I'm reading right now, talks about emotivism, which is not really analyzing virtues for the sake of the virtues themselves, but analyzing emotions. And then this is how we get different, completely different reasons for why people feel certain ways, and therefore that becomes their morality, and no one has a core morality that we all share. So I do think in the sense of like anti-collectivism, this book is really good. Individually, I think people are way too selfish, personally. individually. And if you read it in that framework, and that's kind of the framework I took it as, this is a playbook for what kind of a society we should want to live in. One where, or at least what kind of government you want to live in, one where the individuals are allowed to pursue for their own selfish purposes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I gave you some strengths and critiques of it. I definitely think it's a must read. I don't agree with selfishness necessarily on an individual level, although I do to some extent, but I think too much of anything is not good. I do think we've gotten way too carried away as a society to expect government to do everything for us, government to be the moral police. I think Ayn Rand is completely right about that, and I want to know what you think. So again, objectivism redefines selfishness as a virtue when guided by reason, not a sin of harming others. So this probably in her defense, she does say selfishness within reason to the point of not infringing on the rights of others. And let me just end this video, this review of this excellent book with a quote. The first concern of a rational man is himself, because without himself, there can be no values, no goals, no life. It's about living for yourself, not against others. I think those two things can be congruent. Let me know what you think. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Bye bye.